Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our panel for taking the time to be able to be here. And Mr. Pena, I just want to be able to make sure that I've got some clarity. When we've had testimony, Chief Tidwell came in, presented his budget, proposed budget to the Natural Resources Committee. The Forest Service does not track costs associated with ESA litigation. Is that correct?
That's correct. We don't have a mechanism to track any specific cost related to any of the litigation.
I'm just a business guy. Would that be a sensible thing to do, to track some of those costs to see? Because this is certainly diverting resources that are necessary to be able to recover a species under the goal of the Endangered Species Act. Would that be accurate?
We're having to apply resources to respond to litigation, and I guess from our perspective, if we, knowing the amount of it's costing us to do litigation isn't going to change the fact we have to respond to litigation.
But if we can certainly get a response out of these committees, if we know how many dollars, if we want to recover the species, and I think we all see the value, knowing how many dollars are being diverted that could actually be used to achieve the goal. That's the point, I guess. Mm-hmm. So you would agree that it would be useful for the Forest Service to actually examine that and find out what the real costs are associated, not only with litigation, but also with costs associated for manpower that's required to be able to get the information available?
We'd be happy to investigate what it would take to be able to report on the costs.
You should have it on your books, shouldn't you?
Excuse me?
You should have it on your books. Somebody's writing a check.
Well, the cost of litigation is beyond the payment that we may do for a
But you certainly know what you're directing your people to do.
The fact that we are directing people to do work, we don't have the ability in our accounting system to finally account for everything a person does throughout the day. It's budgeted, and they do many things. Our employees do multiple things in any given day, and to be able to account for that hourly, we didn't believe and we don't believe would be effective use of our time administratively.
In interesting perspective, I'll tell you, in the private sector, we do that on a regular basis in terms of some of that analysis, but to the goal of actually being able to achieve recovery in a species. The state of Colorado right now, we have the threatened listing of the Gunnison sage-grouse, the greater sage-grouse. In our state, working with our governor, working with local landowners, we have great recovery programs that are in place right now to be able to actually help protect the species, to be able to enhance the habitat that's going on. Wouldn't it be a sensible approach, rather than having a one-size-fits-all program going across the West, to be able to encourage these local conservation efforts?
Well, I believe that we're attempting to do that. I think when we look at what is
actually the listing is still being threatened by the federal government. Why aren't we taking opportunity to be able to have those local conservation efforts, the state efforts, be preeminent as opposed to the one-size-fits-all coming in from the federal government?
Well, I don't know that that's the case, sir.
No, it actually is. That is the real threat that's going on.
My experience with that and the sage-grouse listing is the Fish and Wildlife Service is taking into account the actions on private land as well as on public land. And they're trying to make a determination on the adequacy of those plans in concert. And so it is, from my understanding, what the conservation efforts that are being planned on private land, non-federal land, does have a bearing and is significantly taken into account by Fish and Wildlife Service on their decisions.
You know, and just on kind of a personal note, when I'm listening to Mr. Hopkins, does it concern you when federal policy is effectively taking land and going to be able to control that land? We have something called the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution that requires just compensation in the event of taking. We just heard some testimony that that's being impacted. Is there a real concern when we look at the litigation and some of the policy going on that it is an overreach?
I don't believe I can respond to that because the litigation that we encounter is focused on federal lands. It's not focused on private lands.
I think that we're seeing that policy actually impact those private lands. And Doctor, maybe you can answer. When we use hatcheries, do those count to recovery goals?
I believe there's a factor for the number of individuals produced with hatcheries, especially, and again, Mr. Schrader knows more about this. I think what I know about it is from his part of the world, but the concern there is that hatchery fish that are released at an older age than the embryos and hatchling fish that are growing up wild survive differently, and so they don't give credit, I don't think, for all the hatchery fish, but for some.
Thank you. You'll bet.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now